In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a Doctor Strange mirror dimension inspired fractal with geometry nodes. I'm going to upload this completed project file with some notes to my Gumroad. You can download it for free, or you can pay a small price to support my channel if you would like to. Let's get started. First, you'll want to download the 3D scan of the window from Sketchfab that I've linked to in the description. I always download the GLTF file because it seems to work better. Import that, and it'll come in a couple parts. So select those parts, make one active, and then hit Control J. In edit mode, merge by distance to remove any unwanted vertices. It comes in with a few extra objects, so we just want to do a clear parent and keep transformation, and then we'll delete those extra objects that we don't want. Now we're left with just the mesh. Let's name it mesh window and put it under the set collection. I've got a few collections here just to organize. So what we want to do is chop this into its individual parts and then piece it back together. For my final product, I modeled the entire thing and redid these stained glass windows so they'd be a lot cleaner and more photorealistic to look at in the end. One thing I learned from working at a studio is to get to the end and visualize the final product before you get too deep into refining things. Let's first build this center flower part. So first, let's center the origin at the center of this window, and then center the whole object at the origin of the world. And then in edit mode, let's isolate this one petal, duplicate, and then P to separate by selection. And then let's center this petal in edit mode around the origin and rotate it so it sits upright. And then let's name it instance center. Let's do the same for the triangle. Duplicate and separate, and then center that, and we'll call this instance triangle. So let's next do the edge part right here. Now let's duplicate and separate, call this instance edge, and then center this one at the middle of this circle, and then rotate on the y-axis -90 because we want it oriented the same way as everything else. And then let's also separate this circle part, and we'll call this instance circle. Alright, that's all the parts we need. So let's hop into geometry nodes. Add a cube, and we will call this geometry nodes fractal. Make a new system and pin it so it doesn't disappear when you select other objects, and delete the input. Let's hide all our instances and unhide the window. And now we'll start instancing our shapes. First, let's make a mesh circle. And then we want to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis so it faces us. And then if we mess with this radius, we can make it so the circle aligns with the center of that y, which is also the center of our instance object. And then if we grab the instance center object, make it relative, and then do an instance on points, plug geometry into instance, you get a bunch of instances. But there's way too many. What we want is the same number as these, which is 6, but I want to overlap them, so I'm going to make 12. Now we've got 12 of them, but they're not oriented in the right direction. So make a normal node, and then on align Euler to vector, plug the normal into the vector and the rotation into the rotation. And then the axis will be the z-axis. Now if we hide our mesh window, we've got something pretty similar. We can mess with the radius of this circle to get it a little closer. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Now if we start scaling this radius down, we've already got an interesting fractal shape happening. One of these is oriented wrong, and I'm not sure why, but if you rotate that circle 90 degrees on the y-axis, it goes away. Next, let's do the triangles. We can just duplicate this whole setup, plug it into the output, and then replace the instance center with the triangle. Now we want to make it 6 because there are 6 of them, and then if we unhide our window for reference, we can mess with this radius until they line up. Then we'll do our edge pieces. So duplicate the setup again, plug it in, and change it to the edge, and then scale until they line up. They aren't oriented right, so if we mess with the Y rotation, we can get that situated, and then adjust the radius till they line up better. And then I want to add that inner circle part into this same setup. So if we duplicate the object info and make it the instance circle, we can do a join geometry, combine those, and then if we go into shaded mode, it's black, which happens because they're being joined but they're not being treated as instances. So if you just click use as instance, that will work fine. Alright, let's join these 3 components together. So join geometry. First I want to join the outer parts, and then I want to join the center part. Alright, and we've got most of the window rebuilt. We don't have the center part, but I don't want to actually use that. I want to just duplicate this flower pattern inwards repeatedly for that fractally infinitely scaling effect. So up here for the center setup, let's just isolate this circle, plug it in all by itself. So disconnect that and plug that into the output. What we want to do is duplicate this circle and scale it inwards repeatedly. So what we can do is duplicate the mesh circle, give it 9 vertices for 9 instances of the circle, and then a radius of 0.001. That's putting all these vertices right in the center here. And then if we do an instance on points, our circle will be the instance, points will be the second circle. Now there's 9 of these, but we can't see them because they're all on top of each other. So make an index node, plug it into scale, and each one gets scaled outwards. We don't want it to scale outwards, we want it to scale inwards, so we can do a map range node and set the from maximum to 9. Now it scales inward. And then if we just do another math node and add a value of 1, the outermost one won't get scaled at all. So if we plug this in as our points on which to scatter things, then we get this crazy repeating looking pattern. I want to scale them all inwards more, so let's do a float curve, plug that in after the map range, and if we drag this center part inwards, we can scale those secondary instances down until they reach the center and fill that in. Let's look at our final result again. Next, I'll show you how I animated this to transform from a seemingly ordinary looking stained glass window into a trippy fractal mirror dimension thing. Let's first animate this central part. We can do that in a few different ways. If we mess with the radius of this circle, we get that cool effect. And if we mess with this factor on the float curve, we can scale those inner parts outwards. So I just want to grab a timeline and set your end frame to 150, and then we'll set a keyframe for the factor at 1 and another one at 170, factor to 0, and another keyframe. Now they scale outwards, and then at the same time, let's scale up the radius of these circles. So setting a keyframe with I, go to 170 and scale that radius up. They'll start separating at a certain point, so just bring it out to where they don't quite separate and set another keyframe. And we instantly have something interesting happening. I don't like how these outer parts are intersecting with that mesh. So if we do a transform at the end of everything and then move it forward on the y-axis, we can also add rotation into the mix for this. If we rotate the circles up here, make another index node, because we want to rotate the iterated circles all a little bit differently. And then we do a combine XYZ, so we're only rotating on the y-axis. And then if we do a scene time, make a math node and multiply seconds by index, duplicate the multiply node, and then set it to something like 0.1. I don't want it to start out spinning, so let's start at frame 40, set this multiply value to 0, and then go to frame 170 and set it at 0.1. Let's see how that looks. The way you can see these keyframes in your timeline is you have to have the object selected, so I'll just turn off overlays for the moment. And then if you have a node selected, it'll show you the keyframes for that node. So if we go to 170, set it to like 0.05, that seems like a good speed. I don't like how at the end there's a hole in the center of this. So if we go down to the end of the center setup, we can do another transform geometry. Set that to 0, and then do a join geometry. Plug in the original, and then make a value node. Plug it into scale. Set the value to 1. We then have a duplicate of our center setup that we can scale down till it fills that center. The power of procedural nodes. Let's quickly animate the outside. I want these triangles to scale outwards along with the center, but we'll leave the outermost ring alone for a minute. So the center starts scaling outwards right away. So let's go to the triangle setup, and we're going to animate the radius. So set a keyframe at 1 and another one at 170, and then scale that up. I also want to animate the scale of all of these outer instances together, which we can do by plugging a transform node into these instances before they go on. And we'll plug another one into the triangle instance over here. We'll make a value node and plug that into scale on that one, and then also scale on that one, and then set the scale to 1. Now, starting at frame 40, let's animate the scale of all those outer parts. Go to 170, scale them up to something a little bit bigger. And then I want to scale up these center circles separately. So let's duplicate this transform, duplicate the value node, plug it into scale, and go to frame 40, scale to 1, set a keyframe, go to 170, scale that circle up, hit I. That adds a little bit of interest. One thing we want to do is move this circle so it's slightly underneath the other mesh, because we don't want faces that perfectly overlap. So if you move it down on the y-axis just a tad, 0.02, then they won't overlap. I also want some rotation on the outer parts, but I want it to be a little bit more than just them all rotating together. I want to duplicate this entire outer setup and rotate one clockwise and one counterclockwise, so we get that overlapping geometry effect that makes it look so cool. So since I have these merged together before they're merged in with the center part, we can work over here, make a transform, duplicate the transform, and then make a join geometry. Join those back together, and then move it back 0.02 so they're not overlapping. Make a value node, plug it into rotation on each one, and then on one of them make a math node and multiply by -1. And then we need to do a combine XYZ, so it's only rotating on the y-axis. And now if we mess with this value, one of them is rotating wrong. That's because we need to put this multiply on the other side of the combine XYZ. So let's animate this value to start spinning a little bit after the center starts spinning. So frame 70, set the value to 0, keyframe it, go to frame 170, set the value to something higher, like 3. That's way too fast. Something lower, like 1.4. I'll quickly animate a camera. One more thing we can do if we hop back into geometry nodes is we can rotate these center instances individually on their axes, which adds a little bit more flavor to our cocktail of random fractal stuff. So if we go over here to the center and we find our center instance, let's make a transform, plug it in, and if we rotate on the y-axis, we get this interesting spirally shape happening. So let's just keyframe it at frame 40, keyframe the y-axis, rotation, go to 170, and rotate them until you get something cool like that. And then let's just watch that through. For my final product, I grabbed this mesh and pulled it out so it was outside of the view. And I also modeled each one of these 4 instances using curves and a profile shape, as well as tracing the stained glass patterns with the K tool to make edges where they needed to be, and then a wireframe modifier to mesh those edges. I applied a simple glass material with a bump texture on it and made it partially see-through so any light could come through the other side that you wanted. I added some dust, some dramatic lighting, rendered it out, and then did some basic compositing in Blender. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a few things. I'll see you in the next one.